Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about the anti-drag laws of the United States and how it could possibly affect pro wrestling, if at all. So for a little backstory, several states in the United States are trying to respond to the drag queen story hour type of events that have been happening all over the country. A lot of the drag queen story hour, that stuff is a tamer version of things that was happening 2 or 3 years ago, which included children doing drag, children being brought to drag shows, children being strippers on stages, children being exposed at Pride Parade to kinks and other obscene, perverse behavior by adults. So now some states are starting to counteract this stuff by banning children at these events, labeling these events in some ways adult, quote unquote, adult cabarets. We're going to get into all of this stuff later as a way of limiting children's access, or limiting these people's access to children. Of course, this created the whole groomer situation and people being labeled groomers and all this kind of stuff. But the reason why I'm doing this video today is because PW Insider was asked a question about it. And I really hadn't thought about it until they asked. So I'm going to go through the question, the answer, and then I'm going to go to what I did my own research on. All right. So here's the question that was asked to PW Insider. I believe it was Mike Johnson. With the worrying increase of anti-LGBTQ laws popping up in the country, how do you think this will affect wrestling companies with openly queer and trans performers? For example, Nyla Rose is transgender and Sonny Kiss is gender fluid, and they dress based on their gender identity. Based on insanely vague language of these laws, wouldn't it be possible that they could be affected if AEW travels to these states? This is a very good question. This is a very solid, well thought out question. It's provocative. Here's the response. Unfortunately, it's all uncharted waters. I don't know, and I can't say whether one of these asinine laws could end up with a professional wrestler performer persecuted for being their true selves or even performing their chosen character in specific costuming. I'd advise every single one of those performers to check with their company's legal team if and when they tour in those areas. Anything that is written to try to hold someone's freedom to show the world who they are or criminalize their chosen art form is garbage to me. So I hope we never get to the point where a pro wrestler is demonized for these reasons. All of this is arcane and stupid as laws criminalizing rock and roll music decades ago, only worse. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of moralizing by the people who were, exposing children to being strippers and kink and this kind of stuff, which, look, I'm going to be honest. I'm of two minds on this, right? As a libertarian, adults should be able to do whatever they want. If you want to be in a parade, dressed in a dog costume, humping each other, that's on you. When you introduce children to it, though, it becomes a different situation. Now, all of that being said, it would have been nice if PW Insider would have done just a little bit of digging, just a little bit of thought into these laws. For starters, they're not anti-LGBTQ laws. They're laws that are specifically aimed at what children are exposed to. Now, liberals have a knack for generalizing. That's just kind of what they do, and the right does it too. But they just take something that is meant to limit children's access and exposure to drag queens or whatever, and decide that, well, it's obviously anti-gay. Well, it's like, well, do you have to be a drag queen to be gay? No, you can be gay without being a drag queen. So where does that come from? But I did look into these laws, these various laws, because I wanted to know what a real answer to this question might be. So when you look at some of these laws, for instance, and one of the things that really kind of sticks with me is I'm against the government getting involved. The government shouldn't get involved in these situations. But when you see Drag Queen Story Hour recently and here in the Detroit area, for instance, in Royal Oak, they had a drag queen story hour event, and protesters said days before it happened that they were going to be there. So what ended up happening is you had an anti-protest pop up, and so there was like dozens, if not hundreds, of people outside of this establishment yelling and screaming at each other. All of them were adults, and it could have easily turned into a brawl or some kind of violent outbreak. And in any event, what you typically end up seeing is this situation where, drag queens are being utilized as weapons, ideological weapons, because nobody cared about drag queens 20 years ago. All right. That's just a fact. It's something that is in vogue today. We know that the right have largely been against regular homosexual teachers and Boy Scout troop leaders and all this kind of stuff. Gay pastors and things like that. They've been against it. So the idea that they are for like the priest touching the young boys seems a little ridiculous because it's not true, right? They really don't want gay men to have any access at all to children. But it turns out that a lot of gay men end up having access to children. They seem to have more feminine interests, which is, not surprising because they typically have a more feminine brain. I know people say, oh, there's no such thing as a male and female brain. Well, it is. Biology does not comport to your politics. I'm sorry. So let's talk about these laws real quick. So I looked up the Time magazine article on this stuff, and they said 14 states have passed these anti-drag laws, each with similar language. Now, of these 14 states, I'm not going to go through all of them because it would be pointless to do so. Most wrestling companies do not go to most of these states. So that's the first issue. Is a wrestling company ever going to go to Idaho? No. What about Kansas? Probably not. What about Arkansas? Not likely. There's just so many of them where these laws are just not relevant. They don't go there anyway. So if you're talking about the anti-drag law of Montana, does anybody actually go to Montana? No, they don't. So why do you care about the anti-drag laws of Montana? But there are at least 3 states that I can see where this kind of thing is definitely relevant. Arizona, Tennessee, Texas, all right? Texas, because Texas is big on wrestling. Tennessee, because it's actually the home base of Impact Wrestling, who has a transgender wrestler on the roster, Giselle Shaw, and has openly homosexual wrestlers on the roster too. Texas is regularly visited by AEW and WWE, even though WWE is not as important in there because they don't have any. They have gay wrestlers and of course Sonya Deville and maybe a few others, but they don't have like any trans wrestlers or any drag queens or anything like that. But the NWA regularly visits Tennessee, and they also have a drag queen on the roster. So these kind of things, they are important. They are important to know. So what are the laws in these states that are, that could possibly impact the career of a potential wrestler? So in Arizona, now I didn't just stop at reading one article on Time magazine. It would have been nice if anybody would have read an article anywhere and talked about it. I actually went to the laws themselves. All right. So if there was a link to the law, or if I had to look it up, I did. So Arizona, they actually they conferred with LGBT organizations, one of them being Gays Against Groomers. Gays Against Groomers was noted anti-LGBT by Time magazine. When you go to Gays Against Groomers website, it's a lot of rainbow flags and typically liberal looking people who are just against the sexual grooming of children, basically children being exposed to drag queens, sexual content, etc. Which, hey, guess what? That's okay. It's all right for you to be gay and against that stuff. But apparently, in order for you to be LGBTQ, you have to be for children being exposed to drag queens and sexual content. Anyway, what Arizona bans, for instance, It bans what they call adult cabaret performances on public property and locations where the performance can be viewed by minors. All right. So the adult cabaret is defined as a performance that features topless dancers, go-go dancers, exotic dancers, strippers, drag performers, drag shows, male or female impersonators, or similar entertainers, regardless of the performance is for consideration. So what they're saying is, if there's going to be topless, go-go, exotic strippers, drag performers, or whatever, these things cannot have children at the venue, and these things cannot be on public property. So that means in Arizona, now when you look at what the situation is going on, just to back up a bit, they're trying to ban the drag queen story hour things. These things usually take place in public libraries, and they usually take place in public schools. So they're saying private venues can continue doing whatever they want. And since most stadiums and arenas are private venues, they can do whatever they want. Now, the hook here is going to be locations where a performance can be viewed by minors, because wrestling shows typically do have minors in attendance. Now, you could argue that in some of these laws, let's give you an example for of one which might actually be of interest. Kansas, for instance, they had their anti-drag laws is technically an obscenity law, and the obscenity law would say materials with devices promoted to emphasize their prurient appeal. They are obscene if an average person applying community standards would find it patently offensive. Sex acts, simulated sex acts, sadomasochistic abuse, or lewd exhibition of genitals lacking in artistic, educational, political, scientific value. These are definitely drag performers and cross-dressing. So in Kansas, it might be a little bit more, because it's an obscenity law. Therefore, it's a little bit more vague. But you're not going to go to Kansas 9 times out of 10, so who cares, really? But in Arizona, they give you a list of examples. So if you're a wrestler, you're not a go-go dancer or a topless dancer. But what if your gimmick involves dancing? And, most of these laws are not aimed at like male wrestlers. So if Randy Orton goes to, Phoenix, and, he's in a Speedo for, 40 minutes or whatever, no one's going to consider that to be obscene. That's a pretty good question. It's a philosophical question. What is the difference between somebody like Randy Orton being out there in a Speedo versus some drag queen being out there? Well, the nature of Randy Orton's character is not going to be sexual. He might be mostly not wearing any clothes, but there is not going to be any gyrating. There's not going to be any interaction with the children. Unless he high-fives children or something like that, maybe even take a picture. He's not going to be putting any money in a child's G-string, nor is one going to be putting any money in his Speedo. And for people who claim that stuff doesn't happen, it did happen. So you can argue that philosophically, Randy Orton just wrestling and wrestlers period just being in tights is a little bit more skin than most of these states will allow, at least in trying to combat children's access to sexual content. But there's nothing in this law that says that you can't cross-dress, or that somebody will get arrested for cross-dressing. What it says is that these things have to be done where they cannot be viewed by minors. Now, that definitely could affect a wrestling show, because if you're Impact and Giselle Shaw is on the show and Giselle Shaw is in the ring, Giselle Shaw can be viewed by minors. And if Giselle Shaw chooses to dance at any point during this performance, could that be considered a drag show? I'm not going to go into who Giselle Shaw is. Do your Googles. Same as Nyla Rose. Do your thing, okay? But if Giselle Shaw, for whatever reason, decides to dance for whatever reason, does it then fall into one of these aspects as a go-go dancer or drag performer or something like that? Probably not, because the nature of the entire program is not based around this kind of content, you know? So it's not likely that this would affect a wrestling show. It's not likely. Even if one performer did it, it's not likely to affect the overall show or what the nature of the show is. Now, Tennessee, which is a big one because Impact is based in Nashville, for the record, they have a similar law with similar language to Arizona. And that's kind of how these things happen. It's called benchmarking. It is when you see somebody else do something and you kind of model that. A lot of these states with their anti-drag laws, that's what they've been doing. They've been modeling each other. So some of them have gone way overboard, super Christian. Idaho is one of them where it's a sin and it's immoral, and they're not going to Idaho anyway, so you're not too concerned about it. But Tennessee, they use similar language to Arizona. It bans adult cabaret performances on public property and where adult cabaret performances can be viewed by minors. They have the same definitions: go-go dancers, exotic dancers, strippers, male, female impersonators, or similar entertainers. It says the content that is harmful to minors is whatever form of nudity, sexual excitement, sexual conduct, excessive violence, sadomasochistic abuse, lacking in serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So, frivolous sexual activity that is meant to excite people, sadomasochistic abuse, things of that sort. So this brings us to another wrestling promotion, not just Impact. Now, Impact does do, again, like I said, they have Giselle Shaw on the roster, they have other gay wrestlers on the roster. This is definitely something they should probably look into. But GCW, for instance, GCW, they do excessive violence. You know, you should, and I know some people are, actually as disturbed by children being exposed to excessive violence as they are excessive sex. So, a guy getting hit in the head with a plate glass window, or rolling around in thumbtacks, or raking each other with barbed wire with children present, that is definitely something that you should consider. For people who have been on this channel before, I know I attend GCW shows when they're in the area, the Detroit area. I was definitely surprised to see that at a venue that still sells alcohol, there were children present. At a venue where there was fluorescent light tubes breaking and pieces flying all over the place, there were children present. You know, when there was excessive amounts of cursing, there was children present. Of course, that the impetus of that, it falls on the parents. You know, usually it was a dad or a family that was there, and dad was okay. He has his beer, he's sitting there with his son, and they're, yeah, you know, and you're saying to yourself, you know what, that's not too bad. At least, you know, dad has some kind of control over the situation. But then you see mom take the kid to the drag show, and you're kind of like, what the hell? And yeah, you can say that it's unfair to have that sort of conversation. Can dad take the kid to some excessively violent wrestling show, while if mom takes the kid to drag queen story hour, that mom's a terrible parent? It's like, well, I think both of them should reconsider what they're doing. You shouldn't take your kids to GCW shows. You really shouldn't. Because for starters, GCW does have they have, I think, two trans wrestlers that regularly wrestle on the show. But mostly because of Effie, who regularly does openly homosexual things in the middle of the ring. We've talked about this stuff on this channel before, where he simulated masturbating in the ring with Jon Moxley. He also had a kissing contest with him and Moxley. He also pulled out a dildo at one point during a match against the mini guy from AEW, Marco Stunt. He used a dildo in a match against him. So this guy does openly sexual content in his shows. So if you go to a wrestling show, you could be exposed to openly sexual content. And not want to be. So that's something that people should consider. And I would be interested in knowing what his response to this kind of thing would be. Because he does this stuff sort of to troll people and thinks that it's kind of cute and it's funny. And when and in defending, let's say, women bleeding excessively on Dynamite, his response was, well, you're a viewer. You don't get to pick what the wrestlers are doing. You're just there to enjoy the show, and they're going to present the show as they choose to present the show. And then you have to say, well, you got to think about it. The state's going to have has some authority in this situation, and they're going to say, this is how you can and cannot present the show. Now, it doesn't matter what my personal opinion of that is, even though I personally don't like the idea. If you want to be perverse and offend people on purpose, knowing that you're offending people on purpose because that's how you get attention, then this is the reaction that you want. You want people to write laws against you because people politely asked you to stop doing it before they started passing laws. Before people started passing these anti-drag laws or whatever, they were politely saying, stop bringing children to pride shows. Why are you doing that? It's disgusting. Stop doing it. So they did it more and more because it pissed people off. So they said, I'm just going to take more kids to the drag shows. Then we're going to bring the drag shows to the kids by taking them to the libraries and taking them to the public schools. So now this is a response. So if you want to troll, this is your response. Okay? And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is what people who prefer more government in your life. This is what happens when they get more government in their lives. They start complaining and whining and saying, oh, it's anti-LGBTQ. But you're the ones who wanted to force the issue. Now you're mad that there's pushback. It's like when people asked you politely not to do this, you told them to go to fuck off, essentially. So at this point, they're telling you, okay, fuck off. We're going to put the cops in the way. If you start doing drag shows around children, you're going to get arrested. Now, in none of these situations have I seen, is it a felony? Most of it is a misdemeanor, which means it's a fine. And I have my own personal things about misdemeanors. It really makes no sense to arrest somebody just to give them a financial fine. And any fine will probably be paid by the promotion anyway, so it doesn't matter. If you're a performer and you get picked up because you did a sexually suggestive thing with a child in the crowd, the company is going to be under a lot of pressure to just pay the fine and drop it. All right, let it get over with. But you shouldn't do that. Texas. So Texas merely just changed the definition of what a sexually oriented business is to include drag performers and cross-dressing and nudity. Now, of course, nudity, again, that goes into the wrestling part. Most men in wrestling are half nude or semi-nude. Would that be considered a sexual-oriented business? Not really. Because again, wrestling is simulated combat. What these people are actively trying to attack here is the sexualizing of the performer to try to sexually excite a child. That's really what the idea of it is. Now, I know that a lot of wrestlers, FE being one of them, and so many others, they have these false equivalencies. If at any point you ever wore a wig for Halloween, you were a drag queen. If you ever wore makeup for a football game or something like that, you were a drag queen. It's like all of these false equivalencies. Like, a guy who maybe dressed up as Harley Quinn or Catwoman for Halloween, all of a sudden should be for drag queens and should be drag shows for kids. It's A-okay. It's like, no. No. I've seen too many of these articles try to argue that anytime a man has ever worn makeup, that all of a sudden he should be considered a drag queen. It's like everybody knows what a drag queen is. All right. We've been seeing this stuff forever. Right. We know what a drag queen is. Stop trying to make it seem like every time a guy ever puts on a wig as a joke or puts on a skirt as a joke or ever cross-dressed in a movie or cross-dressed for a play or whatever the case may be, all of a sudden this person is a drag queen. That's not what they're trying to interact with here with these laws. Now, I'm not saying that those things are right, because I'm against men doing drag shows. I'm against Big Mama's House and Norbit and Shanae and Wanda and all that stuff. I didn't think it was funny when I was a kid. I don't think it's funny now. I don't think it's a joke for men to run around in wigs and lipstick and that kind of stuff. I've talked about this stuff on this channel before. It is, to me, obscene. But these are adult men who choose to use that form of comedy. Okay, as long as other adults have the choice to do whatever they want, perfectly fine. Well, Mongo, would you ban Mrs. Doubtfire? Robin Williams was in drag, and he was around children. I was like, well, that was weird, but he was dressed as a grandma. There was nothing sexual about that. And that's the thing that people are not really understanding. And one of the things I'm trying to really get over here in this conversation is that just because a man's wearing a wig, he could wear a wig for any reason, or wear makeup, or even high heels and a skirt. Is the nature of the performance sexual? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. 9 times out of 10, there is nothing sexual going on a wrestling show. 99%, matter of fact, 100% of wrestling shows can go on without any sexual contact, without any simulated sex of any kind on these shows. So it shouldn't affect wrestling at all to have an anti-drag law in place and you go to town. It really shouldn't have any even your Giselle Shaws and your Nyla Roses or, whatever, shouldn't really be too affected by these laws. Which, let's be honest, Giselle Shaw is really the only one to be concerned about, because Nyla Rose doesn't appear on these shows anyway. I don't know when the last time Nyla Rose even appeared on AEW. Maybe it's Rampage or something like that. But it is something to consider. And you have to consider what you're doing and the pushback to what you're doing. What you're trying to normalize is not normal. Okay? But I am 100% against people just arbitrarily using the power of government to stomp down on things that they don't like. I just say there are better ways to handle children being dragged to pride shows. There are, and these drag queens at the library, there are better ways to handle that situation. It's definitely I think passing laws is probably the nicest thing that they could do, because it definitely could escalate. And sometimes in some of these situations, it nearly escalated, especially in situations where there's fathers who really don't like this stuff, or a dad that's going through this kind of thing. And their child is being conditioned in school to do certain stuff. They're not going to be happy. And you should, as an adult, have better decision making than to do these kinds of things around children. It's literally that simple. The onus is on the adults. The children should not be exposed to sexual content. I don't see only people who disagree with that are absolute degenerates. If you, by definition, think that children should be exposed to the sexuality, homosexuality or heterosexuality, because nobody wants their kid exposed to some big boob chick, flailing around in the mud either. That's why when wrestling was doing that kind of stuff, it was TV 14, and mostly it was liquored up guys in the crowd, college students. And that's why people think that stuff was so cool, because it was chicks taking all their clothes off on television to sexually excite the crowd. And, that really damaged, let's say, WWE's reputation for a long time, despite the fact that it was enormously successful financially at the time. It limited their appeal in the mainstream. And then eventually it went out of style, and now they have to do an apology tour over it because, oh geez, so sorry that Sable showed her breasts on TV so many times. I'm so sorry Jacqueline was naked on television so many times. I'm so sorry. We didn't mean to do that. It's like, but there was no reason for you to actually start doing it other than it was a cheap way to make money. And you could talk about your First Amendment right to speech and expression, and all of that is very true. And I support that even if you didn't talk about the First Amendment, just the right to express yourself as you wish. I absolutely agree with that. But when you take that kind of stuff to children and you have no boundaries and you don't respect boundaries, and people ask you nicely not to do this stuff and you choose to do it anyway, well, now you're looking for the fight. You're picking the fight. And sometimes you're going to lose. When you pick a fight, sometimes you're going to lose. This stuff, these laws are being passed because people ask you politely not to do drag shows in libraries. Stop doing this stuff in public schools. Stop taking children into strip clubs. Stop doing kink at Pride. They've been doing that stuff for years. People have been politely asking them not to do this. And they decided they're going to do it more and more and more. So now this is the response. Okay? It's their fault. If you say this is anti-gay or whatever, why didn't you stop when people asked you not to do it at Pride? Hey, how about not doing kink at Pride? Well, it's nice for kids to be exposed to kink. Well, guess what? Now the state has said if you expose kids to kink at Pride, you will be arrested. And now you're sitting like, oh, how dare you? It's like, no, how dare you? You're the adult here. You know, you're the person that's supposed to exercise good judgment. So now the onus is on the adults in this situation, which would be the pro wrestlers, to have good judgment. If you're a trans wrestler or a gay wrestler or a wrestler who wrestles in drag, you have to now make sure that when you're in a certain state like Tennessee or Texas or Arizona or Kansas or West Virginia or Idaho or Montana, that your character is not explicitly sexual, and that if children are present, that you don't interact with them. Because I guarantee you it's not going to... People think that, when something is illegal, that the law is just, immediate when they interact. Like somebody's going to have to, complain, usually. You won't get a complaint if you're a drag queen around the ring or whatever, and there's a kid 4 rows back. Nobody's going to call the cops because, there's a drag queen in the same room with a child. Nobody's going to do that. That's not how these laws work. People speed, they break the law, they sell drugs, they murder each other. It usually takes forever for the cops to find out about it. I can guarantee you it's only going to be people who are explicitly violating the law where the government is probably going to get involved. But these laws shouldn't exist. They shouldn't exist because they are a violation of the First Amendment. They shouldn't exist because adults should have chosen better than to get themselves involved with these degenerate situations. But again, like I said, I am of two minds on it. On one hand, I absolutely want the destruction of Drag Queen Story Hour and Pride parades and children at Pride parades. I'm not going to back off on that. I do not think children should be exposed to that sort of content. But I do think that using the state is the wrong idea. Come up with something better. Come up with a better compromise to this situation that doesn't involve the heavy hand of government. Now, do I have any ideas of how to fix this situation without government being involved? No, because any solid libertarian argument against the government being involved with this would assume that the adults in the situation are rational, average people. And that's not what we're dealing with when it comes to people on both sides of the aisle. The people who are homophobic, they don't want anything to do with drag queens and trans people. They don't care how a drag queen is dressed. They don't like them. They don't want them around children. And the drag queens want unfettered access to children. They're not willing to say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be in libraries. Maybe we shouldn't be in public schools. Maybe we should, if we're going to have Drag Queen Story Hour, be at a private venue where parents can pay to have their children entertained by drag queens or whatever. Stuff was occurring. But then when the pushback began, the protests started, then all of a sudden the drag queens started to cover up. It started being like, Oh, I'm just Auntie Honeybee reading children Cat in the Hat. And it's like, it's the same thing with the books in school. You know, that same situation. These books are openly sexual. They're drawings of homosexual acts, sexual acts. And these things start getting banned from schools, and everybody's like, well, they're banning books. It's like, did you see the book that they've banned? I wouldn't want that book in my house, and I'm 38. So I certainly don't want a child to have access to that book. If Michael Jackson would have had that book in his house, he'd have went to prison. If R. Kelly would have had a book with underage people in it, you know, with underage girls performing oral sex in a book, he would have gone to jail before he actually did. It's only when it comes to gay people that these things are now supposed to be quote unquote educational tools. It's not, there's nothing educational about it. There's no educational or artistic benefit to be had from a drag show or from strippers or from any of that crap. But it has nothing to do with wrestling. So all of the stuff I'm talking about, again, the main focus of it has been pro wrestling. Pro wrestling is simulated violence, not simulated sex. All right? That's softcore porn. That's Cinemax. That's, you know, whatever they do over there. That's most TV shows now, simulated sex. Children shouldn't be watching BMF. All right? Children shouldn't be watching Power or Snowfall or anything like that because of the violence and the sex and the language. They shouldn't be listening to rap music because, again, violence, sex, language. So it's consistent with people who want to ban all of that stuff. The people who wanted to put parental advisory stickers on your album. Yes, as a child, I listen to it anyway. And there's going to be kids who are going to be watching BMF with their dad or with their mom or whatever. It's going to be up to the parent. But it's going to be the same thing with this drag queen story hour stuff, with trans wrestlers being in the ring and stuff. It's going to be up to the parent. Better. It was wrong to put all that kind of sexual content into children's, you know, something that children watch and something that they participate in. It was wrong to do it in wrestling, you know, where children were watching. Sure, you could put the impetus on the parent, but there's some on the promoter too. There's some on the performers too. You have to know that your audience is going to be, at least a certain percentage of it is children. And I did a video on this channel before in closing. This is the second time I'm closing, probably the third time, where I talked about how WWE was blamed for a couple of children who committed homicides using wrestling moves. And, you know, they tried to defend themselves and that kind of stuff. And, you know, rap music is almost always blamed for how thugged out a lot of black teenagers are. And culture is quite often discussed as an important piece of how the United States is dealing with some subculture that they've created, whether it's, you know, satanic rock music, thugged out gangster music, violent video games, or whatever. They're always looking for a cultural blame for this. I'm not going to blame drag queens. If a child is interested in drag queens, I blame the parent. I don't blame drag queens or trans people for a child being interested in cross-dressing. I blame the parent. Just like I don't blame the thugged out music or video games for violent children, I blame the parent. Parents have to have more control over their children. Ultimately, those are the three principles here. The adult who is doing the performance or making the product, you're the drag queen, you're the game developer, you're the rapper, you're going to be in control of the artistic element of your creation. If you create degeneracy because it's entertaining to you, or you find it to be of some value, or you think it's fun, then don't be surprised when you get pushback. If you're a parent, it's up to you to protect your child from the degeneracy that the creator is creating. And then there's the government, who really shouldn't have anything to do with this, but then they do, because 9 times out of 10, one or the other principles in this situation have either dropped the ball or they've gone too far, and now the government has to get involved. And to me, that really shouldn't be the case. You should be a little bit more understanding of other people's positions and lifestyles. And yes, there's going to be people out there who do things you don't agree with, and you should stay away from them. And you should, but the Matt Walsh thing where we should stomp it out of existence is like, that's a bit excessive. The hyper gay, we should put it in everybody's face, is just as obsessive. It would be nice if people could come to a clear understanding, and I think the government tried to do that, with the exception of maybe a few, which actually used pretty harsh language on these laws. Most of them just created a clear delineation between what is appropriate for children and what is not, and basically saying that drag queens and drag shows are not appropriate for children, which I think up until recently, up until maybe 2 years ago, most people agreed with, because there were no drag queens with children. There were no drag queens hanging out with children, not on a mainstream level, until people started doing it to push the trans issue, and that's just how it is. You open the ball, you open this Pandora's box, and these laws fell out. And while I don't personally agree with them, I agree with the sentiment behind them. I don't think that government is the right answer, though. But also, don't think that most wrestlers will be getting arrested.
MagMongoSlade. Best house I ever drew, Daddy.